for your storm. Now I'm going to start off by reading something that you wrote. You said, "My falling off the edge looked like this. One day I was the co-host of a nationally syndicated talk show, and that night I was a patient in a psychiatric ward." Now that's obviously a drastic turn of events. Can you please tell us what happened?
Yeah, from 1987 to 1992, I was the co-host of the 700 Club. Loved it. And to everyone who just saw the outside of my life, I looked like I was doing fine. But inside, I was still dealing with the pain of my father's very violent death when I was a little girl. And I think when you adore your father, and the last time you ever look in his eyes, he has such a look of hatred. I mean, as an adult, I understand that it was brain damage. As a child, I just thought, what did my dad see that was so terrible? And I tried to hide that all these years, but God knew the truth. And he allowed my life to hit the wall at 200 miles. And literally in the morning, I sat beside Pat, co-hosted the show. And by that evening, I was in the locked ward of a psychiatric hospital. My dad died in a psych ward when he was 34. And when I walked through those doors that locked behind me that night, I was 34 as well. I literally felt as if I'd gone to hell. But what I discovered is sometimes God will take you to a prison to set you free.
Wow. You actually were depressed, as you just said, to the point that you considered suicide. Were there some specific promises from God that actually helped you get well?
I think it's interesting that so often the promises of God become most real when you find yourself in a place that's almost the antithesis of the promise. Because I've always loved, Romans 8 is one of my favorite chapters of the Bible. It begins with no condemnation and ends with no separation. And I used to cling on to that. Nothing can separate us from the love of God. But in that place where I felt like I'd been abandoned, I discovered that God knew exactly. In fact, I had an encounter with an angel, the only one I've ever been aware of, before or since. About 3 o'clock in the morning, I didn't get into the bed. I pulled a blanket off the bed and I sat in the corner of the room. And they told me for the first night I was on suicide watch, they would check on me every 15 minutes during the night. And at 3 o'clock in the morning, I heard someone come into my room and I didn't even look up. But they walked right up to me and stood in front of me, and I saw a man's feet, so I looked up. Looked to me just like a hospital worker going off duty, but he put something in my hands, and it was a lamb, like a stuffed toy. And he turned and went to the door, and when he got to the door, he stopped and he turned around and he said, "Sheila, the shepherd knows where to find you."
Wow.
And at the darkest moment in my life, when I felt as if anything that gave me any value as a human being, I heard the greatest news of my life, that no matter how lost you feel, the shepherd knows where to find you.
Wow, that is so amazing. Now, you mentioned your father a little bit earlier, and you talk about that personal story in your book as well. When we lose our loved ones, that is one of the times we definitely have to hold on to those promises. What helped you through that?
Well, I even look when Christ was having the most significant conversation with his closest friends, right before he knows that he's about to be betrayed, they are looking for what their understanding of Messiah was, what Isaiah spoke of. You know, unto as a child is born, unto as a son is given, and the government will be upon his shoulders. They're waiting for him to march into Jerusalem and take over. Jesus knows the opposite is about to happen. And he said to them, in this world, you will have trouble. That word there, trouble, that Greek word, is like a storm at sea. In this world, you're going to walk through some storms that you think, I cannot survive through this one. But Christ said, take heart, I have overcome the world. And he went on to tell them, you know, I have gone to prepare a place for you. And if it wasn't so, I would have told you. And I actually went back not so long ago to that very place. My father actually threw himself into the river. He escaped from the hospital one night and was found in the morning caught in the salmon nets in the river. And I took my father's journey and I stood on the edge of the river. And I felt Christ say to me, Sheila, that night he went from this grass into my arms and I carried him all the way home.
Wow, that's one of the great promises of God, that he's with us even until the end. You know, we talked about these specific situations that you've been through with the loss of your father and with the depression. People go through those type of circumstances and other things, but for some reason we always find it very difficult to hold on to the promises of God. Why do you think that is?
I think the very word promise means so little within our culture. You know, I remember when Christian, our son, was a little boy, he saw a commercial on TV for a fishing rod that promised you could catch a fish in 10 minutes. And he was like, Mom, I still want that. And I was like, baby, fishing's a skill. They can't promise you're going to catch a fish. And he said to me, with the innocence of a child, Mom, they couldn't say it on television if it's not true. And I think, gosh, what a sad reality that our culture lies to us, our government lies to us. And I think that's why it's hard to take God at his word. But what I have discovered is that God is not man, that he should lie. We read about that in the book of Numbers. When God says something, no matter what the circumstances look like, if God says it, you can stake your life on it.
Amen to that. Now, there are probably people watching right now who are going through great storms in their lives. What would you say to someone today who needs a word of encouragement?
Sometimes when God doesn't answer our prayers the way we want, it affects how we feel about ourselves and it affects how we look on God. We think, Lord, you answered her prayer. So why didn't you answer mine? Do you love her more? Did she pray better? Was there some formula? Paul tells us we see as in a glass darkly. And it's nothing to do with the heart of God. He is committed to every child who loves him to get us all the way home. And I love to remind people, you know, in Israel, Christ called himself a shepherd. I grew up with that image in Scotland of the shepherd coming behind the sheep with his sheepdog. You will never see that in Israel. In Israel, the shepherd goes ahead of the sheep. And Christ in John 10 calls himself the good shepherd who, after he brings his sheep out, goes ahead of them. And I love to tell people it's not the sheep's job to get themselves home. That's the shepherd's job. Christ is committed to take you and help you get all the way home. You just stay as close to his heart as possible.